Thank you very much. And we'll get slides going. So I have pictures and clips to show. But yeah, so I've been working on the history of women's suffrage off and on since 2018. Was invited for League of Women Voters to speak about it at their state meeting, and had realized it was centennial of the 19th Amendment coming up. And I wondered what in South Dakota had happened. And someone had written a book, which was amazing. But we've had a lot more archival material digitized to certain newspapers to get at. And they asked me if I could identify people important to the suffrage movement. And I had to study everything so I could tell who was important or not. So that really got me going. Lots of notes. But I will try to keep this to the crash course, like I said earlier. So there's a lot more to the story than be able to share tonight. But we'll hopefully have everyone learn something new at least. So the big picture is that the women's suffrage movement activism for women having the right to vote has a long, over 50-year history in South Dakota. The first votes were in the 1860s. And they were pretty small, just at the legislature. There wasn't a lot of activism around it. And it was speculated that it was because there were so few people in Dakota Territory so far that they needed as many as possible to serve in political office, to be able to vote, to count as citizens. But neither passed in the 1860s and 70s. It got very close in 1885. The legislature was meeting at Bismarck, and the bill was championed by John Pickler of Flockton, and him and his wife were big suffrage advocates. And it passed the Commons and the House. Passed both houses of the territorial legislature. It wasn't House in the Senate. Anyway, but it was vetoed by the governor at the time. He thought that such an important issue deserved a popular vote, and he wasn't convinced that such a controversial issue should be enacted as people were ramping up to become a state. He wanted to leave the controversial stuff until after a state had passed. Get that is what he put out in a letter for the press. But there were enough people interested that the state association organized the State Equal Suffrage Association in Huron in 1889. The first ballot measure was in 1890, so they were ramping up activism, press materials, forming local clubs to further the issue in 1890. It came to ballot 6 times and failed every time until 1918. So as we go through, I won't say that every time. But it didn't pass until 1918. And the state association changed into Universal Franchise League in 1912. So those are the 2 big state advocacy groups working on it. But also the Women's Christian Temperance Union was very interested in support of suffrage because they wanted to pass prohibition to limit the sale and consumption of alcohol. And they thought enough women cared about that issue that if we could vote, those issues would pass. So that organization was the third ally for many years for women's suffrage. By 1918, there's a lot going on in the country and in the state, but suffrage does pass. In 1919, the 19th Amendment passes nationally, and we ratified it pretty quickly. And then it was ratified nationally and enacted in August of 1920. So I think Tennessee ratified on the 18th, which just a few days ago, the anniversary of that. And then it was confirmed by their state governor and then enacted on the 26th. So that's Women's Equality Day every year. And then also Native people in South Dakota had limited franchise up until 1924, when the national bill made every Native person a citizen with the eligibility to vote. So it wasn't across the board, it was piecemeal for many years. So that's sort of the end of the 1920s story of suffrage and voting rights, although it's continued. So starting back in the territorial days, the big events, there were statehood conventions, 3 of them in Sioux Falls. Suffrage was an issue at every one. Suffragists came, they sent letters. Another advocate, Henry Blackwell, from Boston, him and his wife had a very important newspaper. His wife was Lucy Stone. And Blackwell came and spoke at one of the statehood conventions here as he was visiting Montana's other states also. They were all held at Germania Hall in Sioux Falls. The statehood conventions decided not to put suffrage on the Constitution that would be voted on, but at the 85 and 89, they committed to putting it on the first ballot of the state, which was the 1890. I mentioned the Pickler bill earlier. That is John Pickler there, and the territorial capital in Bismarck. Like I said, it got very close. He made a quote, something to the effect that, my wife wants to vote, as I believe all of them should. This is something I believed in for many years. It's not just sort of a political trick. The first suffrage organization was started by Marietta Bones of Webster. She tried really hard. She brought in Matilda Jocelyn Gage from New York, who was one of the national leaders to try to come campaign. They went by railroads in the city. But Bones decided that at that date, there was too little organization, people were too spread out. It was hard to get a movement going. But there was a lot of petition work going to the territorial legislature for 1885, but then when they tried to get it in 1887 and then support it for the 1889, and at least one petition campaign happened in Brookings in 1888. Once the state association got organized, it started in Huron in October of 1889. 2 of the big leaders were John DeVoe and Emma Smith DeVoe. And John designed this logo for the association, and he wrote many songs and did press work, put out articles and editorials. And then Emma Smith DeVoe was the state lecturer. So she did massive campaign tours. She'd hit a county for a week, go small church to small school to small church, and then end with the county convention at the end of the week to organize a club to keep the work going. And she usually sang the songs he did. One was about his time in the Civil War and as a veteran and the women that took care of him. And the line was, "And now my vote will go to free them, for they nursed and got me through." So that was, they encouraged veterans to come to their events to hear that message. Native franchise was on the ballot. There had been allotment, so land was divided up on the reservations, and the thought was that if they took land, they renounced their tribal rights, they could become citizens after a period of 25 years. And in 1890, the 25-year period was coming up, so there was a measure on the ballot to limit the franchise rights. And there were people that supported suffrage that were concerned about native franchise. Clayton Tinnen was a newspaper editor at Kimball, and he compared it to freed enslaved people, freedmen in the South. The prospect of them voting was not good, and he felt the same way about native people voting. And John Pickler also had concerns, and he thought that white women should be able to vote to counter this new demographic of native men voting. So they're, as wonderful as the suffragists were for what he did, they also had plenty of racism as well. They made appeals to major political parties for support, roundly denied by the Democrats. The Republicans eventually gave them time to speak in between the scheduled program, but didn't end up putting it on the platform. And the independents were initially supportive, but by the time the independent people asked for that campaign, they didn't put it on the platform then either. So it was a series of disappointments, but they were supported by the farmers movement and Sophia Hardin of Doral County, both the suffragist and the state secretary for the Farmers Alliance. So she was an important leader for that year. There was a leadership crisis. The state Equal Suffrage Association started with a lot of guys in leadership positions, and the national speakers who came didn't like that. And by the summer, that had all come to a head, and there was a convention in Huron, and there were late night meetings, and the leadership were overturned, people elected. So it wasn't a very smooth campaign.
Wouldn't you have loved to be a fly on the wall? That? Sorry.
I'm sure they were all very polite and genteel, but, but we did have national speakers. So Susan B. Anthony is hopefully a name. She was the national president, and she came twice. She came initially in 1889 to get momentum going, and then she spent months here over the summer of 1890, which is one of the hottest summers on record, and she was 70 years old. But made these big campaign tours, and apparently by the time she got back, reportedly her sister said that she finally looked her age. Oh. But the one mentioned she did come to Brookings and spoke at the chapel at the college, including she told us about her girlhood as compared with that of average girls of today, and ended her remarks with a few words of advice to the young ladies especially. So it was both a campaign talk, but also just a general lecture about what it is to be a woman today. I don't know what that means. Most of the audience were women, the college students or not, but it might have been. And there was apparently some effort at the college. One guy wrote to the newspaper in Washington Springs from the college here, said suffrage is booming among the students. There was a pin that the state association had the logo that he says many people were wearing. And until he could get one, as soon as he had the money for one, I think was the tell him, he had a yellow ribbon that he was going to wear to support the effort. I believe my mother, who engineered me through the greater part of my life, I was good and knows pretty nearly as much about you. No. And yours for the mother and sister, especially someone else's sister. So there were a lot of male allies for the suffrage. One of the women from Brookings that was active that year was Almlie. She was the corresponding secretary and had at least one meeting that she hosted at her home. And she was a professional abstractor. That was her career profession over many years. Had offices downtown at the courthouse for a time until they wanted abstractors to not have offices right in the courthouse. And so then she worked from her home at 902 Williams. And I tried to Google 902 Williams, and I think the street names have changed, so I don't know what the current street is. But was well regarded. And then Dr. Lewis McCloof was president of the college during this time and was an invited speaker for the state convention in August. That was after the leadership had changed. They really tried to boost the Mitchell Convention, which was right before Republican state convention. So they had invited big speakers, and he expressed support of both women's abilities, intellectually and professionally, and his support. There were campaign speakers going about all over for Brookings. Anna Howard Shaw came and spoke at the Opera House, and she was the national president after Susan B. Anthony. And so she was a big deal too, but this was one of her so early campaigns. She didn't have a great time according to later writers. Thought it was miserable, the transportation was terrible.
What has changed? What has changed?
But she was also very highly appreciated generally.
Good for her.
In September, the county had a suffragist convention at the Methodist Church. Reverend Olympia Brown was another national speaker that came and spoke at the Methodist Church. There was quite a bit of support from Methodists and Congregationalists for years. And then Chetowitz, of Frankfurt, who ended up moving to Minnesota, but she spoke at the Norwegian Lutheran Church, and it was advertised as a special appeal to that immigrant community. There was fairly active promotion of suffrage within Scandinavian communities. And sometimes they would try for the German communities, but alcohol consumption was such a part of German culture that they were usually anti-prohibition, so then anti-suffrage, the connection between those two. So there were some rough calls where a speaker would show up to a German in town and be told to leave town. You can't speak at the school, you can't speak at that. So, and then I found in the newspaper when the new Methodist church, the current Methodist church, I believe, was dedicated, they had an image of the old ones, where they would have. So after 1890 failed, they tried to go back to the 1893 legislature and advocate for other issues important to women. One of the ones I remember was that they wanted a woman to accompany any female who was being sent to the state asylum at Newton for mental health issues. Usually a sheriff would deliver them. So they wanted it to be mandated that there be chaperone essentially on those trips. There were a variety of political issues that they thought important, and they decided to try to just advocate directly for those at the legislature. And the old Capitol building would have been where they went in Pier. The new one, the current one was built in 1905 and 1910. The big leaders were Anna Cranmer of Aberdeen and Anna Simmons of Fulton. And they were WCTU and equal suffrage presidents kind of interchangeably. So this is the period where those issues were tightly allied, those organizations. A prohibition measure did pass. That is wrong, sorry. Prohibition was enacted with the Constitution and repealed in 1896. So a lot of their opponents sort of dissipated because they got their repeal, they were all set. Prohibition was no longer for the time being. So I apologize there. But then after Prohibition was repealed and opponents dissipated, they had a rough time at the legislature in 95, but by 97 they were invited to speak from the Senate platform and listen to with great respect. So that liquor lobby had a big impact on their reception here. And it got put on the ballot again in 1898. The national organization was hesitant to support anything, so the state group and the WCTU led the effort for that year. They did try to appeal again to immigrant communities. They invited Ulrika Brun from Chicago to speak at Scandinavian places, including the Norwegian Church in Madison, is one of her speakings. There was, for the first time, anti-suffrage campaigners that came to South Dakota to speak. As far as I can tell, in that year it was just the one. Mrs. Crannell came from Massachusetts to speak against suffrage. From their national, Massachusetts was opposed to the equal suffrage. It was a very long name. But she was a national speaker and he for a while. And right before October 14 would have been those few weeks right before the election. Get the message there. In Brookings, this was for those that were here earlier, I mentioned there was one business. The state headquarters was in Brookings for 1898, and apparently above Collins Clothing Store. So I still have research to do to figure out where Collins Clothing Store, what building that would have been in. If anybody knows, let me know. Because very interesting. There were state headquarters in Huron and at two different time periods in Sioux Falls once. And this year. But Claire Williams was the secretary and handled a lot of the correspondence. And she was here, so she set up headquarters here. The Brookings County Suffrage Convention, they had a symposium and asked all these questions. Does the wife need it? Does the mother need it? Does the unmarried woman need it? Does the working woman need it? does the businesswoman, professional woman, tax-paying woman. They had all these sort of local speakers contributing to the discussion of suffrage convention for the county. There was also an anti-suffrage group locally. I don't know how big it was, but newspapers love to take jabs at the suffrage movement. And this was they waged a hot campaign. Male sex had better take to the woods on election day, because at the polling places, advocates for certain issues could stand outside and lobby people directly as they were entering. So they anticipated that that would be a contentious place to be. And right before the election, Brookings suffragists put out a petition and printed all of those that signed in support, starting with the Equal Suffrage Club members and then also non-members in the club, and put that in the paper. So that was a great way to get names of people research. Claire Williams, like I mentioned, was the state secretary and did some campaigning also. There are a lot of correspondence items in the state archives. They have the John and Alice Pickler collection, and Alice Pickler sort of gathered all of the state association materials from which she was involved and kept them. So when the Pickler Museum opened in Boston, the group that was working on the house found all the materials and got them to the state archives. And over the last couple of years, the state archives has been trying to digitize a bunch of things. And Pickler collection is one that they got digitized. So you can read everywhere that Claire Williams got that was kept on that website. And it said there were 535 results for her name, because everybody was writing to her to ask for materials or ask for speakers. Yes. And I loved that quote that I put up there that was attributed to her, at least, and printed in a book that was written about the suffrage movement in 2019. But that women's suffrage is not a question of expediency, it's a question of abstract right. Right is right, truth is truth, must prevail. She was certainly right to the point. Anna Hyde in Brookings in those years hosted many suffrage meetings, at least two. And then in 1910, she comes up in the newspapers hosting a meeting again. And her husband's house is in the Central Historic District in Brookings. So that's at least one place where I know suffrage history in Brookings happened. And the photo and the link, the city has a walk tour of the district. So encourage anyone who wants to go check out the walk tour. The 1900s, the WTU and the state suffrage people are still allied. Tensions are starting to form. The state held its annual meeting in Brookings, the first regrouping meeting in 1900. In 1902, the state suffrage people tried. There was the new initiative and referendum option to put measures on ballot. So they got all the petitions, they got all of the private signatures, they brought them to the state's attorney, and it was denied because he decided, he just, in consultation with the other state leadership, decided that constitutional amendments couldn't be put on the ballot by initiative and referendum. And that's since changed, but at the time, that was what they came up with. And Alice Pickler, when she made a state report to the National Association, said the great surprise awaited us when the Secretary of State, Secretary of State, was not able to plainly speak the English language as a Norwegian immigrant. So, like her husband had a certain amount of prejudice, this time against immigrant populations, who were going to tell her, a Yankee heritage woman, what she couldn't do. But there was commitment to keeping things going, even though numbers were low in these years without a ballot measure. Selena Johnson was from Pioneer and was state president for a while. And in that quote, we have no intention of giving up the fight. announced to the national group too. By the 1909 legislature, all those tensions came up. There were two groups coming to the legislature advocating for suffrage, not together. One came from the WCTU group, Cramer, Luella Ramsey, she was from, and then Felina Johnson. And then there were sort of the new cadre of folks, one Dina Pettigrew from Belle-Fourche, and then Rose Bauer from Rapid City. She's very interesting. She started in Vermilion and moved to Keystone, and they had Bauer family band that went around, and Disney did a movie about them in the 60s.
Really?
Yeah. And so she played music for a lot of campaign events. She'd bring her cornet to get people's attention to come listen to her speak. And she apparently whistled loud enough that the cornet and whistling drew people in. But they all showed up in Pierre, not working together. And the way that those were introduced and supported or not, or whether it was full suffrage, partial suffrage, if it was just for women that owned property or what, it all sort of got muddled. And it was sort of a last minute thing where the bill as proposed was changed. It was full suffrage, and it was passed so quickly that the newspapers were pretty shocked. There was speculation that opponents had supported full suffrage because of the Carter attacks. In that campaign, they were having troubles. They thought their first convention at Aberdeen would help sort it out. And it did yes and no. They sort of reorganized a state suffrage group that was just the Votes for Women campaign, but it was still equal suffrage citizenship. And the WCTU decided to sort of run their own campaign supporting the bill. So they just separated organizationally more definitively at that point. And Lydia Johnson of Fort Pierre became the president. And after this campaign, she went to USD and got a law degree. She'd already been working with her husband, who's a lawyer, but she went and got a degree in law right. She brought her 5-year daughter to Vermilion to finish school. And the Socialist Party of America sent speakers to South Dakota to support equal suffrage. So these two at least came through. There was quite a body of supporters for socialism around Sisseton, so both of these were in Sisseton, but they went to Madison. I didn't see that they ever came. There were new people on the scene. In both years, they came to the state fair to campaign, and there was a new women's building to campaign from. They could have lectures, they could have tabling, they could put up banners on anything and everything they wanted to. So they did a lot of that. And then I think in 1910, there was again a leadership internal split, and there were some people working from the women's building, and then the suffragists around Huron had sort of split off and were working from the Beadle County building separately to vote for the sale. The state headquarters that year was in Sioux Falls in a building downtown. They boasted having 3 street-facing windows from which they could hang posters. And there was a photo from Bryn Mawr's digital archives of Cicely Tinsley, who was the state, she was the state secretary, but she was sort of paid staff person. And then her own sort of secretary to actually do the work. They both did it. She would have been typing with correspondence. But there was a photo of their headquarters. Not a big event, but a weird one, is that 2 women from Fort Pierre went to Chicago to put on placards, no vote, no tax, and picket. There were people picketing the Chicago collections office. And I don't know why these 2 women were put down for that. But one of them was Hazel Phillip, who was daughter of Scotty Phillip, who was renowned for getting rancher to save the bison, started a bison herd that helped the conservation of that species. And he had married a native woman to be able to have land on one side of the river for the reservation growing up. So Hazel was one of a few people with Native ancestry that came up in the records that supported suffrage. And Edith Fitch of Hurley was one of the editors. Her and her husband had the Turner County Herald, and she became the press secretary over the summer. And reading her stuff is amazing. So Turner County Herald is one of the newspapers. The state archives has the papers, and they digitize them, and they're put out through the Library of Congress on a website, which is really fun to search through. So you can read some of her things for that. But she was also a very sort of forcefully, she had a wonderful writing style. I was quite forceful and sometimes fairly sarcastic. Another one is something to the extent of the why are these men so afraid to engage with me in debate? So she was willing to help people out. Like it said, women are not downtrodden, but they are a subclass so long as they must obey laws which they do not make. In Brookings, there was the Reverend Margaret Olmsted, was a Unitarian minister with her husband, and was in Brookings for the campaign year, and did some speaking out in the county. Often found, like, she often spoke with another person who went out. So Bonnie Andrews came up as some of her team, and she was on the English faculty at the college. And then Gertrude Walker of Bruce, I have on the next slide, was another local speaker, and they went out to organize local clubs and get them active. She had been active in suffrage in Minnesota before, and was ordained in 1894. Earlier, there was an Iowa sisterhood of Unitarian female ministers who went out into the mission fields, tried to start churches. And she also studied sociology, and some of what she spoke on were social reform, welfare issues, showing the engagement in political issues beyond just suffrage. And she came to Brookings in 1908, but then they moved sort of early in 1910, so she didn't get to finish the camp. But Gertrude Walker did. She was the state auditor, so like any organization, you have to have people that keep the financials straight, and she was one of them. And she was on the publicity committee because she ran the Bruce Herald newspaper. Her father was in the newspaper business too, and I couldn't quite tell from the newspaper articles if he had the Herald, but she ran it, or if it was hers. But she was consistently referred to as editor or proprietress or publisher. And she apparently put out a public challenge for men to come and debate her on the matter. She had trained in music in Chicago, and that was a fairly common occurrence for women that had higher education than the suffrage movement in South Dakota. A lot of them had degrees in music, and had been from California before the Walkers came up here. And she once was on a local school board and put out a news item showing sort of disillusionment with the current principal and calling for him to be replaced. So, was active in the local community and others too. And South Dakota did have school suffrage for women, so they could vote on school board decisions and for school board members in these years, and serve on the school boards. After the 1910 ballot failed, they reorganized, and the Universal Franchise League was formed officially in 1912 in Huron. And Mamie Pyle became president, and she was president through the end of the campaign and was the first president of the League of Women Voters when the Franchise League merged or transformed into League of Women Voters. And her house in Huron is also a museum. So if you're out traveling, the Pickler Mansion in Faulkton is a place to see, and the Pyle House in Huron is also a museum place to see. And both were in their families until they became museums. So not only are the house is still there, but the collections are amazing too. And they were successful in 1913 of getting it on the ballot. There were the The state suffrage groups had newspapers in a couple campaign years. 1898, which either glossed over or skipped. There was one that year. And then it was resurrected for the 1914 campaign year and run this time out of Pier. The Billinghurst and the Hipples, May Billinghurst and Hipple were sisters, and Ruth Hipple's husband ran the Pier newspaper. And so she had newspaper publishing experience, and she became the editor of Messenger pro bono. And apparently Billinghurst put up capital to get a newspaper. And they enlisted people like Lydia Johnson to write articles, so Lydia would write about legal issues at the moment. And then West River, there was newspaper support. Rose Hour, again, campaigns in that year. Her sister was Alice Hostage, who was the de facto editor of the Rapid City Journal when her husband, he was chronically ill for years, so she ran the journal. And so lots of sister stories that cropped up. Some are daughter ones too. Lots of husband, wives, and quite a few sisters. For 1914, a lot of outside speakers came and sort of big names. Marion Drake had just finished a run for the Chicago City Council, but she had run against one of the Chicago mob boss, political bosses, and lost, but was an attorney and made a lot of press doing it. Full off what Bob LaFollette. Her father had run for president, and she was trained in dramatics. So when she came to speak, she would often give suffrage plays as sort of oratory. Rosalie Jones had done a big press gathering march from Albany to New York City, and marching all the way gathered a lot of press, and then came to speak about it in South Dakota. Antoinette Funk was one of the national organizers. I don't know as much about her, but she came from one of the fairs and described the campaign and the fair in detail, which was very interesting to read. Ann Shaw came back again, and then Catherine McCullough, I think was also an attorney, and came and campaigned West River, especially. And that the issue of the journal that talked about all the West River campaign talked a lot about where she went and where she spoke. But then it had to come and try to get back on the ballot the next year. The 1915 legislative session, the temperance people were really trying to push for prohibition to get passed again. Because it had been killed in the era earlier from 1896, and they wanted to get passed again. And so they really wanted the focus to be on prohibition in this campaign year, and the suffragists refused to let their issue go. So there were apparently heated arguments in the legislature between those people. But it did pass and get on the ballot. One of the new campaign strategies was this flying squadron. They had visiting speakers. Emma DeVoe had moved to Washington by that time and led Washington's successful passage of suffrage in 1910. And so she back as a visiting speaker. Effie McCollum Jones was a minister in Iowa, and Elsie Benedict was a newspaper editor from Denver. And so they came, and they went by rail, but then sometimes by car, because Jones, I think, broke a rib when the car was going over rutted roads. It was terrible at the time. And there were records back to Pyle, and Pyle's records are USD. So they're all legs of this campaign are part of her collection. But they would go, Benedict would do a street meeting. So she'd just like stand in a car on a street corner and gather people up and tell them about suffrage, and also send them to a theater for the night where Jones would lecture, probably a sort of public lecture with her ministerial experience. And then Emma DeVoe was, they sometimes broke up the teams because they weren't always in total agreement. Just tensions ran high traveling with people that tightly for that long. So sometimes they split up and hit different cities. But in Lead, for instance, Benedict spoke from the main and Bleecker and then sent people to the Home State Opera House which is still standing despite a big fire. So you can visit. There was big anti-suffrage campaigning this year. So there was a state body that organized. Ethel Jacobson was a newspaper editor here, and she led the state association. But they had speakers coming. Minnie Bronson, I think, came from Boston, and Lucy Price was from Kansas. Bronson was from Des Moines. Price was from New York. That was but promoted German language newspapers, promoted their speaking in Sioux Falls, that event. But they were countered by Helen Guthrie Miller from the National Suffrage Association, and Elsie Benedict stayed to counter them too. So the anti-suffragists had a schedule of speeches, and then Miller came like a day or two later, every place they went to speak also. And Benedict sometimes would stand on the street corner outside the theater and shout at, advocate for suffrage to the people who think that and in Brookings, they were at the Opera House. Bronson was going to be speaking. Benedict brought supporters. They had placards on posts, and they wanted to bring them into the theater. And the manager, despite saying in the press later that he supported suffrage, didn't want that level of disruption in his place. So he asked them to leave, tried to force them to leave. And this is where he claims that Benedict hit him like 3 times as he trying to move her toward the exit. And she claims he grabbed her arm and hurt her as he was ejecting her from the theater. So they both claimed violence. And that's kind of as violent as the suffrage movement got in South Dakota. But they eventually agreed to leave the banners and pennants in the office. But in the theater, they were heckling the speaker. They just went in and heckled her throughout it. And they put out their issues in the paper afterwards, telling their story, trying to get support one way or the other. And there were suffragists that were concerned that Benedict's tactics were too militant for the South Dakota market, and that they were hurting their cause. And so at least one, Senator Kerr, wrote to Kyle from Brookings and said, or a former state college, so I don't know if he was still in Brookings at the time, but had known that in Brookings, and wrote that she's certain. I assume he was, yeah. But 16 failed again. 17, lobbying took on a quite sort of fancy, we had a big banquet at the St. Charles Dining Hall that was said to be second as a social occasion of the legislature, only to the inauguration. So it was a big deal. Kyle informed all the suffragists to, wear best behavior, most gracious, etc. But they didn't have any particular concerns that suffrage would get passed again. They had 13, 15, 17, all the legislators majority had shown support. So they weren't terribly concerned. They wanted to make their presence known. And they got on the ballot. There was also a parallel movement of people that were nationally getting tired of trying to fight suffrage state by state and really tried to focus on a national amendment. So the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which became the National Women's Party, was growing nationwide, and they did come to South Dakota and try to start a group. There was a group started at Sioux Falls. They had a chair and a press person, but there wasn't a lot of additional activity. But there were speakers that came, Viola Amadon, and came from Fargo to speak. She was in the press, was considered a pretty suffragist. And so there was interest in South Dakota too about let's just press for the national amendment, stop wasting our attention on the state population. And the war caused one of the two big obstacles in 1918. And the suffragists figured when the war broke out that they would keep going, but they'd try to support and work through the Red Cross and then other organizations that were doing war work. So because they knew that was important to many women around the state too. They weren't going to have much time to work on suffrage because they were doing stuff for the war effort. But there was growing concern about Germans in the state and the effect that they might have both general sabotage, the effect of German immigrants voting in anti-American ways. And there was a Council for National Defense. And there were organizations like that in most states. And the South Dakota one had such concerns that they wanted the bill to be that only full American citizens could vote. Because up until this time, if an immigrant had filed its first papers with the intent to become a citizen, they could vote from those first papers. And that was set up in the territorial days. They wanted to encourage immigrants to come to South Dakota and fill in the population. But that was still on the books, and there was concern about that. So they wanted the bill for full citizenship. And what the legislature in emergency session decided to do was merge them. So the bill, as it was on the ballot, would take out male from the voting requirements and add citizen. And the suffragists thought that, well, this is now a citizenship bill. They're going to handle it. And the governor apparently called Pyle to appear and said, no, we need you to keep campaigning. We're all busy doing other things. We need you to campaign. So the suffragists, what they decided to do was switch all their messaging. So there was all sorts of citizenship, patriotism in the posters. And they had a school of methods where they went around the state and taught suffragists how to campaign differently. And how to explain what the citizenship process was for those immigrants that were concerned they were going to lose the right to vote. They would explain how you finish your citizenship so that you can vote. So they had to do a lot of training and a lot of re-messaging. But they kept going, and they used a lot of existing events. So if there was going to be a parade anyway, like this photo in the state archives is billed as a suffrage parade. But I bet it was sort of a war, patriotism, 4th of July, something. The suffragists just supported and participated. They used a lot of existing events, so they weren't building up a calendar for people and wearing them out from giving or from things, listening to speakers and so forth. Native franchise, there were new organizations. The Society for American Indians was concerned about the sort of rights and legal standing of tribal members across the country, and citizenship was one of their concerns. They were working for Indian citizenship bills. In 1918, they had their national meeting in Pierre at the Capitol, the House, or the Capitol and the Opera House, and the St. Charles Hotel had different meetings there. And Gertrude Baughman, or Zucasha, was the national secretary at the time. He was originally from Yankton and had gone to a boarding school out of state, married someone who worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and lived in different places around the country. Was back in South Dakota for this meeting, talking about citizenship for Native. And Zucasha has become sort of a big figure nationally recently. And they often use the photos of her shortly after she graduated. She's quite young and she's in very formal dress. She was trained in music, so sometimes she had the violin. But so I wanted a photo more from this time period. So there was one in the Pensacola newspaper from Florida of her with her 1920s bob, or tied back potentially. But in DC, she lived in DC for many years and tried to gather support of suffragists for Native franchise. And would sometimes show up in traditional clothing for the events with the braids and sort of do a little bit of a song and dance, but then bring it back to these are the issues that actually matter to us. And you got what you wanted after 1920, help us get. And then the other big obstacle of war was influenza, Spanish flu epidemic. And that stopped public gatherings, like our recent history, stopped public gatherings. Like even a small group who tried to gather at a house, there would be a health official that came and picked them up and put them home. Instead, suffragists tried to do a lot of press work, put stuff in the newspapers that was still going out. And then posters, they would, some from the Black Hills, they said they traveled from Deadwood to Reed and build the road. And so they put posters on trees, posts, or whatever they needed to on the road. And many of the suffragists had limited time, limited resources. Many were helping nurse relatives, community members. Schools were shut down, so Amy Pyle's daughter, Gladys, who became a politician, a prominent politician, later, at the time was a teacher and went to nursing. The school got turned into a hospital and she went community nursing. But it did succeed, finally. And there were two letters that I really liked between Amy Pyle in Huron and Ruth Hipple in Pierre. And Ruth Hipple wrote that it's almost too much to have suffrage. I feel more like crying than anything else. The cars are flying back town with flags waving and horns tooting, and all the children are coming ahead. I have to go wipe my nose and eyes and thank God for it all. So you can tell she was a writer. That's very eloquent. And Pyle was a president / politician. She said that she was very glad the war didn't end sooner. I mean, it was in the Watertown newspaper. The war ends and suffrage passes on the same front page. It was very tight. And Pyle was glad that the war didn't end sooner. They didn't have to redo all the messaging over again. But was very glad. She was exhausted. And they were in quite a bit of the deficit as a state organization because with the war, influenza, people were dying. So I think they said they were $3,000 in debt by the time we ended the campaign. And eventually some fairly prominent politicians like Peter Marbeck donated the funds to make up the deficit eventually. But Pyle did a lot of letter writing to try to get people finally give money that the epidemic was over and such. And she would give up the office she had in downtown Huron to do all that work and give up her stenographer. And so she worked out of her home in that room doing all the correspondence herself. Before it passed, some Brookings things, and actually this was after, so within a month after Pyle was writing to Mrs. Hutton and Brookings about they allocated funds for every state, every county was supposed to give a certain amount of money based on their people, and Brookings apparently owed 600. They'd only received like 75. And Leva Peshapova was one of the field workers. So they figured local women weren't going to have the time to do the work. They had about 5 pretty young women doing field work from the national organization. And that was another mess. Because the one decided to stop working but still wanted to be paid. Once the epidemic finally came to an end and they could have a Jubilee convention in Pierre, that happened in January 1919. And it corresponded with the time when 3 women were sworn in for jobs at the legislature. So bill clerk, reading clerks, the House and the Senate. Marguerite Carter Starr was Ruth Hipple's neighbor. And May Billinghurst, Ruth's sister, came and she had this quote that nearly the whole body applauded. They came and sat in the balcony as these women were being sworn in. And as I glanced around at the older suffrage women looking on, I imagined I could see in their faces happiness and sadness, and the faraway look that told of the long struggle. Dramatic, also. But that was in a letter of January 8th, 1919, so that was exactly what she was feeling at the time. And once the 19th Amendment passed Congress, needed to be ratified, Peter Marbeck was the governor at the time, delayed on setting time for the legislature to come together to ratify the 19th Amendment, but finally agreed to hold the session in association with the party meetings that were happening in Pierre, because he wouldn't pay for any legislators to come to Pierre for the ratification. So if they were already coming for their party meetings or wanted to travel on their own dime, Pyle apparently made phone calls until she had enough legislators committed to coming for the session. But for those that showed up, it passed unanimously. in December 4th of 1919. So that's, and then the 19th, then like I mentioned earlier, ratified August of 1920, finally as a national bill. These are some of the resources I've used from our Historical Society press, commercial advertisement. I mentioned Matilda Jocelyn Gage coming from New York in the early territorial days. The press has published a biography of her, and her son-in-law was Alfred Baum. So there's big connection there. And then Equality at the Ballot Box is a series of essays edited together into the book that they put out on South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming. So there's some South Dakota material, but it's also a regional study also that broadens it out. And there are 3 or 4 articles that have appeared in the quarterly journal that our puts out. And any articles older than 10 years are free on their website. So you can find a lot of those too. And then I got involved with the National Collaborative for Women History Sites. And they have a National Votes for Women Trail. So I've been adding sites to the trail. And I realized that I have non-membranes. So I know I have the hidehouse to add. And if I find out where those headquarters was, I'll have that. There's more sites to add. I didn't, yeah, it's a long list of all the places that were mentioned on the newspaper articles. I tried to hit some, but I have cities that I haven't covered yet. Got on the room, but I need to. And that is my presentation. Special gratitude to all the archives that materials online and research. So enjoyable and easy to get to.
Do you have any information yet on why they wanted women's suffrage?
Why it passed in 18?
Why South Dakota wanted it?
Why they wanted it? There were many reasons. Some women just thought it was right as citizens. They were paying taxes. They were affected by the laws of the country. They deserved to vote on those things. Yeah.
Well, one of the issues I understand at the national level was the fact that if your husband died, they would take your kids away. And that was late in 1870, except in New York and Kansas.
There were many sort of the laws affecting women, which is something Sylvia Johnson was writing about later too. The custody of children was one of the issues, right to property, right to the family money. What happened in the case of divorce or separation, and that, yeah, custody of children was one of those issues.
They have issues like that in South Dakota.
Yeah, the Messenger, reading Lydia's articles for the Messenger would be very interesting. I haven't done that yet. She was one on Issues of Women. I know they were very interested in child labor laws, and the League of Women Voters continued that interest in child labor laws and getting these passed. And there's the Shepherd's Counter maternity bill, I think. And that might have been about custody issues, and they were supporting that. There are, so the Messenger I've not found digitized, but I think our state archives has issued, and that's taking the time to get in there during office hours and also working has been hard. But USC's digital archives does have, it was called the Dissenting Voter, and that was the League of Women Voters' first newsletter, and talked about many of the issues that they had started working for. There were also food laws that they were concerned about. Like flour would be adulterated with sawdust and not regulated at a federal level. So they were working closely with the food and drug. They were, yeah, particular thing about it.
And I don't know if you'll know this, but maybe somebody in the audience. Where is the Opera House? What building is it? I'm assuming it's sort of a repurposed building on Main, maybe?
That I haven't looked at.
Yeah.
And sometimes what was considered the Opera House would change, different owners. Burned and got rebuilt. Huron got. But yes, that everybody knows that too. That is existing.
Is prohibition the main opposition in South Dakota?
Yeah, I think the most active, this anti-prohibition people, like the lobby. There were many people that thought it was a bad idea, just in generally because women were inferior, or because if their husband were voting, they would clearly vote the same way, just be a double vote with no impact. So why even bother doing it? Polling places were immoral places. They might have been in saloons or something. And women shouldn't go to polling places.
Those turn out.
Women would be wasting their time in issues of children. Lots of things were brought up and used. Press correspondence. And the 1898 campaign, there was a publication called the Monthly South Dakotan, and they had a series of articles, essays, pro and against, pro and con for suffrage, that I haven't read in full, but were written about in an article in the journal. So I've read the article about them, but I haven't read them yet.
Are there any further questions?
Things. I was wondering if you
But for my children, they're also coming stuff. But yes, then
she's our ancestor. And her house sits on Fifth Street that she built after her husband died, and she built it so her children could have history, including 2 daughters.
I'm from Aberdeen originally, and I know people that talked about Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Didn't she live in Aberdeen?
I think I actually spent a summer here. I think her permanent residence was in New York, but not only was her daughter was married to L. Frank Baum, but she had 2 other children in the area. So she came for extended visits.
So do you know Sally Rush Wagner?
I know of her.
Yeah,
And
she was my high school classmate, and she is in New York at the Matilda Jocelyn Gage House Museum, whatever it is.
Yes, she in the suffrage history book. Okay.
Wow. With that, thank you so much, Liz, for joining us tonight. Have a great evening, y'all. No need to clean anything up. So there's no need to put chairs away. I am doing that tomorrow.
Thank you.
Oh.